Foxfire. Once I thought we would know everything. That's what this was for, this foxfire, this fragrant energy, like nighthawks screaming at dusk. All winter I stalked elk that were down from the mountain and starving. I walked the low places where they galloped through slush, the rocks where they wallowed and pawed for new grasses, the tooth marks on aspen, the mineral lick, the creek where the water was roiled and milky. I sweated through immovable snow and fell down exhausted, but when I imagined I'd stand in a thicket, my eyes glazed over, my sharp breath, and know the steamy communion of elk, I was wrong. Once I thought we were all gods, blessed, strutting this lovely planet. The path down to our ditch for water, pretty with serviceberry, but transient. As a young girl, I hung upside down with other girls as we hung by our heels from a jungle gym and contemplated heaven. It was a silky place. I preferred purgatory, like a dark cafe, retrievers curled about the table legs and the warm, braided doors. At 78, I'm still the babe of my family. Once I thought they would teach me, that they, Once I thought they would teach me that even their last breath would be a key, but now I see them drifting off from their easy chairs, like a tribe, leaving shore together, the television blaring, their mouths sagged open, and when they return for brief moments, they stare at me as if I were a stranger. All that I will ever know is right here in the wash and till of these few acres. Frost tonight, and behind it, the whole summer, so brief I could still see the bronco-faced calf born to the bloody pasture, and the brown trout suspended in its first glittering insect hatch. There will never be more than twilight, a valley receding to glass, this tiny paradise of common flowers. The waist-high marigolds blaze up like golden dowgers. Venus rises alone, early, to a cold black sky.
Welcome to another episode of Poets in Montana. You've just heard Sandra Alcosser read Foxfire, brand new poem?
Nope, quite an old poem.
Quite an old poem.
This, I have to say, when I decided to pursue my MFA at the University of Montana, my first class was with someone I dearly love, Bill Beavis, and it was a Wallace Stevens seminar. And so the first poem we looked at was Wallace Stevens' Sunday Morning. Now, I only realized years later how well I was nourished by that particular poem, and I've taught it for many years afterwards, as well as Bill Beavis's book about Stevens. But I looked at this, and we were studying meditations, and so I went to my professors and I said, "Tell me how to write a meditation." Everybody went, "Huh? Huh?" You know, we don't know. Just write one. And it's not, a meditation meaning, something that goes back to the metaphysical poets, 17th century literature, not something where you sit in your room and meditate, right, although you could be meditating. But Sunday Morning, I think, really fed this poem. And I like to start with it sometimes because we live in the Bitterroot between Florence and Lolo. No one behind us till well into Idaho. And we have a 30-acre tree farm there. And so I always know I'm home when I start.
Yeah. Well, those are great. I mean, that was wonderful. I mean, since I've lived here all my life, I thought that's a perfect beginning to a Montana poem. I mean, just the whole elk thing. I mean, there's anybody that's ever spent any time looking at elk or on the ground or on the land can identify with that poem. And then you bring everything else into it, yourself and growing up and life, and yeah, it's a beautiful poem.
It's funny because I came here from New York City, and I was directing this program that I started called Poets in the Park in Central Park.
Mm-hmm.
And the Arts Council wrote to me and asked if I'd like to come out. Well, I felt that I had kind of a dream job in New York. I was working with Betsy Barlow Rogers, who's made all of that beauty that you see in Central Park possible. And yet I was in love with my then partner, Philip Mcclay, now my husband, and he wanted to get out and do something in the big landscape. I only had 800 and some acres in Central Park. And so we had no money.
Yeah.
We had all this great stuff that we'd scavenged from the street in New York, which you can do. I mean, people put out amazing things on the street in New York.
Right, and this was what year?
1977.
Okay.
And when we found out how much it would cost to move any of that, it was impossible. So we bought this fish wagon that got as far as Pennsylvania before it sheared off the lug nuts on one of the, there was a step van. And I finally got some truck drivers who were hauling sausage from New York, or from Wisconsin to New York. They were deadheading back.
Yeah.
And so I got them to take all of our stuff, and then we had another little vehicle, another jalopy that we were going on with, and so it was a real crossing to the west. You know,
So this was when you enrolled in the creative writing program out here?
Not right away,
Yeah.
but what I was the thing that hooks to that is when I talk about elk, the one thing that it still reminds me of, if you haven't heard of elk, I mean, when they come through the woods, they sound just like a subway.
Yeah.
You know, just like all of it. Yeah. Loud, clanging, banging, and you're standing there in the middle of it going, I hope they see me.
Yeah, yeah. I remember that reminded me of I ran into a huge bull elk on this overgrown road way up, and they head into Fish Creek, and he had like nowhere to go, and it was this very just the thickest lodgepole thicket that you could imagine, and I thought, no, really? And he just jumped down in that thing and disappeared. And
wow.
You could hear him running away because, like you say, there's the sound of going through that thicket. But I mean, I looked at it, and those little lodgepole, they were about this far apart. It looked like, and you didn't see where he went, the path. It just kind of, laid those antlers back and just
man, you were
right
blessed.
Through,
you were blessed that day.
Oh yeah,
because
no
we could sit this whole time talking about deer stories, bull stories.
Yeah.
I mean, people have done. They've had some real collisions with animals.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, I should probably, before we get further deep, let me read this short bio that's in New York City from the Inside. Is this a recent?
It just came out.
Just came out by George Wallace, edited by George Wallace, New York City through the eyes of poets who live here. And I'm going to read this short bio on Sandra. Sandra Alcosser founded South San Diego State University's MFA program and edits Poetry International. Her poems have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Paris Review, Plowshares Poetry, and the Pushcart Prize Anthology. She received 2 individual arts fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, and her books of poetry, A Fish to Feed All Hunger and Accept by Nature, received, and except by a fish to feed all hunger, and except by nature, received the highest honors from the National Poet Series, Academy of American Poets and Associated Writing Programs, as well as the Larry Levis Award and the William Stafford Award for Poetry. She was the National Endowment for the Arts' first conservation poet for the Wildlife Conservation Society and the Poets House in New York City. Like Sylvia Plath, Joan Didion, Sandra Gilbert, Grace Schulman, Heather McHugh, and other women writers, Sandra Alcosser flew to New York City as a Mademoiselle guest editor in fiction and poetry her senior year in college, and she stayed.
Well, sort of.
Yeah. So she's still there, kind of, but she's still here too. So when did you get your place down the Bitterroot? Not long.
1980.
Oh, okay.
1980.
And when did you decide to do the MFA program?
Shortly thereafter, I was kind of taken. It was funny when I left New York. They said, "Oh, you'll be back next year." Well, I wasn't.
Yeah.
And I actually, the reason it says I stayed was then 25 years later, they got in touch with me to do this, to design this language of conservation program in New York. So for 10 years, I was flying back to New York all of the time, and
okay.
It grew. It was really, it was quite successful. I mean, it was a really, it was the reward one gets for living a long time and for wanting to do something. And I always wanted poetry, because I think of my childhood in the Midwest, I always wanted poetry to come together with service in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And so by doing this particular thing, and what I did was I worked with a scientist at the Wildlife Conservation Society, and I would pick with one particular scientist, Dan Wharton, who was at that time the head of the Species Protection Program for the Western Lowland gorilla and the snow leopard. And he's great. He's from the West originally. And we would meet once a week in the arsenal at Central Park. And the first thing was a pilot program. So for the first thing, this was at the Central Park Zoo. And so the first thing was I did a permanent installation, 6 acres, 27 centuries of poetry. 1 million people come through each year. 1 million people were reading poetry. When Bill Moyers interviewed Merwin, he had seen Merwin's poem
at the installation.
I had the minister of Iceland contact me about this poem by Auden, and I said, "Did you know that Iceland was his iconic landscape?" He'd never heard of Auden before, and so I was able to bring those two together. Although Auden is now shuffled off this mortal coil, so I brought them together metaphysically, I guess.
Right, through the poetry.
But it was they did these in and out interviews, and they found that by combining poetry with this celebration of wildlife, it brought about a 48% improvement of the understanding of what international conservation was. People said they came there saying, I need to see these animals, what can they do for me?
Right.
And they left saying, what can I do for the animals?
Cool.
And
yeah, I think that's a great connection. Do you have something to read from that experience?
I
You brought
do.
a lot of stuff. You
I
want to read?
do.
You want to read something from
yes, well,
that experience?
Yes, because we had this. I didn't see Mark's email until last night, so I brought a bunch of new poems in from the journals. So let's see. Yeah. This is collection of eco-poetry from China and the United States. It was done by Manoa, which is a journal in Hawaii, beautiful journal. And it's the guest editors, well, the series editor is Frank Stewart, guest editors Tony Barnstone and Ming Di. Republic of Apples, Democracy of Oranges. Let's read a couple from this. This first one is about Martin Buber, the philosopher. And his mother left the family when he was a boy, and he would go and spend his summers with his grandparents, where they had a very large draft horse. And Buber is known for his I and thou theory, which I'll read something about at the beginning of this poem. It came from his experience taking care of that horse. Mm-hmm. The horse and the holy man. Spirit is not in the I, but between I and thou. It's not like the blood that circulates in you, but like the air in which you breathe. Martin Buber. The stable shadows indigo as the boy strokes the neck of his beloved that coats his hand with a must of sweat and leather. The dappled gray leans into the pressure while the boy in the red riding habit pours peppery oats into a manger. Then large teeth with small scratches from grazing begin to chew inside its sensitive lips. What better expresses beauty of the inner than infant tenderness toward another? I have watched too, alone in a pasture, wicker, exchanging weathers, no longer beast, no longer orphan beings. They breathe into the nostrils of each other.
Nice.
One change, I think all of these poems are sonnets. After the second book, I wanted to put a governor on myself instead of doing these things that like,
free verse.
Yeah, but expansive.
Yeah. Something short.
And so I started writing sonnets. The one thing that I found out, though, is it suppresses the narrative tendency. And so after a while, then the sonnets started growing to sonnet sequences and so forth. So this one is actually something that I learned in Central Park, but then because I spent part of the year teaching at SDSU, I spend time at the San Diego Wild Animal Park where they are doing reintroduction of condors. So God, the condor, and many tribes have the condor as the god or a god. Mm-hmm. God, the condor. I pull the god of thunder. I pull him from a nest. I pull a little nestling limp, hold him to my chest. From his stomach take half a cup of plastic, half a cup of glass. From his crop lift 4 bottle caps. What will make us well again? What will make us sing? Poisoned by ideas, poisoned by machines. God is cleaning up. Now God is eating. Inside a clown pink face, lead bullet casings, a black boa frames his shoulders like a painting. Imagine, no more soaring, no more Pleistocene, no more clouds pulled together by his wing beats. God's coming for us now. He looks a little queasy. He rubs his head against the rock. He sharpens his beak. And then these always remind me, Richard Howard said that haiku was like being nibbled to death by goldfish, and sonnets kind of remind me of that sometimes too, but they are short. So I'll do one about bison and then one that I wrote for Rachel Carson.
Okay.
Mothers. This is, there's a wonderful reintroduction work that's being done with bison between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And so I've been privileged to participate in several three-nation bison conferences and to get to know more First Nations people, and a lot of the work that's being done, for instance, from Banff is also coming over and onto the Kootenai Reservation and so forth. And when you do this, when you're looking for work, I was looking for poems from all over the world. I wanted a representation, and I was able to get them translated and so forth. But I've started assembling things on bison. I have an anthology that I haven't done anything with, but I've put together, and you kind of become the animal. I mean, you spend so much time with them, and not in captivity. I mean, this was free-ranging bison. So, mothers. From underwater and under tar, down from the walls of caves they came. The biologist made a circle with her arms. That calf's heart must have weighed 25 pounds, she said. Deep inside each bison, there is a Bible. Otherwise, how could they survive our bullets and cliffs, our cities and flames, our soups simmering with the heads of their babies? Each mother grazes patiently a ton of flesh made of grass blades. Do you know about the Black Earth Institute? You should know about it. It's in Minnesota, and Allison Hedge-Koch has just put together a number of poems. I had several bison poems in there. I've become obsessed by bison, actually. But they do an online journal that, and they bring in people to be fellows and so forth. It's a really...
The Black Earth Institute?
Yeah. It's, and Allison's whole journal just came up there, so it's online. This is from another thing. The poet Christopher Merrill, I don't know if you know him, but he's head of the International Writers Program at the University of Iowa.
No, is he any relation to Merrill?
No.
No, okay.
No. He started the Orion Forgotten Language Tour. He's been a real supporter. I think two of my biggest supporters were Phil Levine and Chris Merrill. He's gotten me in situations that I've resisted and that have changed my life. And so this particular poem, he nominates for this place called the Hermitage in Florida. On the it's on the bay, and excuse me, it's on the Gulf. And at first I didn't want to, I got this thing, you've been nominated to go for 6 weeks, and I thought, oh my God, I don't know anybody, and I don't want to go, I'm an introvert, I don't want to go someplace for 6 weeks. And I got there, and Merrill Club's son was actually there as a playwright. It's only 5, they bring 5 artists together, and so I was there with various types of artists, and because of my background, I always felt guilt if I wasn't working. You know, like I had to do my chores and I had to do this, and you know how that really gets in the way of being a poet.
Time consuming.
This changed my life, although I'm still breaking the habit, and will probably be breaking the habit of doing all of my chores before I sit down to write the poem. It's a very bad idea. I was off in this I was staying in the pump house. It was this really cool little place. And I had a porthole, and I'd look out that porthole at midnight, 3 in the morning. These artists worked day and night. I'd never considered doing something like that. Now my husband thinks I'm the most boring person in the world. I just sit at my desk and wait for something to come.
Yeah.
But this came out of that. They were putting on, they have a lot of, they bring, many of the musicians and so forth come from New York City. And they bring them down. Arthur Koppett was my next door neighbor, the playwright. And so they invited us to go to Symphony Space in New York and create something for the time that John Kennedy was murdered and what they considered the death of Camelot. And they left it up to us what it was that we wanted to do. And so lots of people did really interesting things. I wanted to set a woman there, and I just couldn't. I couldn't identify with. I mean, Jackie Kennedy did amazing things, but I just couldn't identify with the 1963 Jacqueline Kennedy.
Yeah, right.
And so I thought, okay, what woman? And I remembered that Rachel Carson had brought out Silent Spring right about this time. The book that made the EPA possible and all kinds of other things. And so I ended up, we were to do collaborations, and so I did a collaboration which I actually have the painter Michael Eads' work. He's a New York painter, and then my poems. So the first poem wasn't in there, but the second poem, so this is 2 sonnets, and so this just predates it slightly, and then we get to Rachel Carson. 1963. Presidents and premiers address the young ladies of the seminary from outer space. Bird shimmy seeds into topknots of trees, beget strangler figs dangling toward gravity to shelter the seminary, who sit in a circle of white pleats and blue blazers and listen to their leaders' voices from outer space preaching mutually assured destruction by land or sea. Who will they rocket next? A chimpanzee? Fruit flies? A dog they snatched from the street? We cultivate anomie, roaring at reality with its roots in everything the king can see. One girl lacquers her hair into a torpedo. Who can we believe, we girls of the seedbed, we young ladies of the seminary? I'd just come to terms with fallout, and along comes Rachel Carson. This is a cartoon from Saturday Review. 1963, and the earth said, "A little less poison, please." With rustling sounds through fallen leaves, the sparrows flitting understory said, "Yes, please, less for me." The ant hoisting his brother's body in the nest said yes. And sharks feeding in the sea, and fish eagles building cribs of mops and lawn chairs, yes, and vultures who couldn't stop eating, could not stop eating. A little less 2,4-D, less DDT and BHC, a little less in our well, a little less in our bloodstream. From the nerves of earthworms to the ovaries of thrush and their exquisite melodies, for everything eating and eaten, a little less poison, please. She, of course, was dying of breast cancer at this
At the
time. And she said, this is not what I wanted to be doing.
Yeah.
She so loved wildlife and large landscapes and so forth. That's what she wanted to be writing about.
Right.
But she wrote Silent Spring instead, and what a hero.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that was back when, it was the Cincinnati River that burned all the bridges down and caught on fire. And I mean, the level of pollution, the little town I grew up in, I flushed the toilet and it went right down to the Clark Fork River. You could walk down and see the toilet paper and the turds.
Yeah.
And people's washing machines. And I mean, you know, remember Ed Leahy used to call the Clark Fork here in Missoula the old town toilet.
Yeah.
Because I mean, and that's what she was, somebody had to do something. You know?
It was the same thing where I grew up in South Bend, Indiana. We'd go
well, yeah, that's the industrial capital of America, right?
Yeah, you'd go canoeing.
Yeah.
And if you wanted to get out and swim, you'd be swimming right there with all of the turds.
No problem. And of course, I remember seeing the George Carlin special not too long ago in which he came on and said, you know, everybody's talking to cleanliness and everybody's worried about, he said, by God, we're healthy because we swam in raw sewage.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly. Yeah.
Our immune systems were tough. Yeah, well, that's interesting. So these were written not too long ago.
No, these are all.
And that's always an interesting thing too, right? I mean, you know, looking back, you're talking about, you know, Camelot and women in America back at that time were, well, you'd had the vote for 40 years. You should have been doing better. You know what I mean? It was that world of Jack Kennedy and Camelot and all
things
the
coming
we know
from
now.
outer space.
Oh yeah.
You know, I was.
Well, it's the anniversary of Roswell, right? Roswell. Yeah.
I was at I was the girl at the girls' seminary, and my parents had sent me there to get me. It was a girls' school to get me away from my boyfriend, and it didn't work all that well because, well, anyway, wasn't. But that, you know, these messages were coming to us. You know, mutually assured destruction by land and sea. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis,
right?
And I can remember, you know, we were learning to twist, use the hula hoop, watching TV.
Right.
Pretty sure we were about to be blown off the face of the earth.
Yeah. Duck and cover, right? The old drills for the atomic attack.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the idea that it was the end of Camelot, it just hadn't really taken that shape in my mind.
No. I mean, I think, you know, probably, you know, in the way that it seems like media and the country always latches on to these sort of super drama things that can lift us up in ways. And there was the youthful aspect of that president.
Exactly.
And so there was hope. And so they just played that up for all it was worth. And they looked beautiful, that handsome couple.
Right.
You know,
and they were doing the twist and using hula hoops.
Exactly. The Beach Boys for happening. Here come the Beatles.
Right.
But it is interesting to, I know, once you're around a while, start looking back and writing about things in the past. And because, I mean, you know, we're younger people now, or the last maybe couple of generations, they have a totally different reality. You know, I mean, because of, they're not really, I mean, they've maybe know some things about the past, but it's hard to relate to what exactly things were like that far back at this point in time, unless you were around.
I learned that. I had been a SNCC volunteer when I was in Indiana, and by the time I got my first teaching position was at LSU in Baton Rouge, and I knew what it had been like when I had been there before, so I had no idea what I was getting myself into. Well, the thing that surprised me is nobody knew what a SNCC volunteer was. This
Yeah.
whole movement had taken place, and
Right.
major changes had been made, but
Yeah.
history had.
Yeah, and it's just so much. We're so bombarded with information. There is almost too much to learn unless you go on a search, some kind of specific search. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, unless you had someplace you wanted to go,
No,
right this minute,
no.
one thing I wanted to ask about was Hugo. I mean, you obviously studied with Dick Hugo, and I noticed in just rereading again last night, Except by Nature, just your sort of line length and the internal rhymes, the music in your poetry is, and that all reminded me of Hugo's work too, in a way. I mean, I think he definitely had a wonderful ear. And so it's a little bit about anything you want to say about your experience there, working with Hugo, and what you took away from all that. And
I've done presentations on Hugo before, and what I decided to focus on, because there are lots of things I don't want to focus on, to be honest.
oh yeah, I understand.
I adored Ripley, his
Yeah,
wife,
yes.
and what I focused on was his sense of humor. The funny thing is, when I studied with him, I wouldn't read his work, because he used to say to his students, "I think you're writing with your hand in my pocket."
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and a lot of them obviously did. I mean, people I've read after the fact, I mean, they were like Hugo clones.
Still,
Yeah.
you'll still a number of people. I mean,
Yeah.
he had that amazing impact
Yeah.
on
Magnitude. sort of.
people, but there were things in his biography that were too close to things I had experienced in my own biography, and so I wanted to keep a respectful distance. What I liked about Dick, in addition to his sense of humor, was the way that he had of telling you something. Like, I can remember he would say, "Is the progression inevitable?" I really like that. I would say that's the essence of his teaching for me. I mean, that's a really important thing.
Yeah.
You get out there and you're just wandering, hoping you survive this poem and you want to get to the end of it. But he had funny ways of making fun of you without you not even realizing that he was he was telling you, loosen up.
Right.
So at one point he said about my work, he compared it to something that Ivor Winters had done, and I knew that he was not a big friend of Ivor Winters. And it was stanzaic integrity, and he said, "Well, Ivor Winters wouldn't let that pass, because I had maybe, I don't know, 8 lines, and then 7 lines or something like that." But what else could I say about Dick? It was just a rich time to be in the program. Not only Dick, Jim Welsh was around, John Haynes was around, Naomi Lazard, Patricia Godecke, and Bill Kittredge, and Bill Beavis, and Frank Harrington.
Was Madeline DeFries still around?
Madeline, I ended up teaching with Madeline for a number of years at Pacific University. I adore her. I absolutely adore Madeline. Madeline and Lois Welch came to our wedding. The first 2 years we were here, we lived out at our Ekstrom's at Rock Creek.
Oh, okay.
And they came to our wedding, and I kind of got to hang out with Madeline a little bit, but then she moved to UMass Amherst, where she taught. So it was years later at Pacific University that I taught with her, and I've written some things about Madeline. I just really adore her.
Well, I don't necessarily have anything, I guess, to add to any of that schooling sort of thing. But one of the things I was going to ask you also was, I mean, have you always written? Did you? I mean, have you been fascinated with language since you were a child? When did poetry sort of enter your realm, or the idea of poetry? Or
Well, I grew up in Indiana, where I think the idea was you get schooled to be it was kind of like Jane Austen, you get schooled to be a good wife or something.
Right.
So I had won all kinds of ribbons and 4-H and so forth, so I got sent off to 4-H camp and had a little thing with this Polish lifeguard. I can't believe it, it was just like walking heartache. But I started this long sequence about the Polish lifeguard, which I have no idea where it is. I'd be embarrassed to even, but that was my first poem.
Okay.
Then I went away from poetry for a long, long time and was writing fiction. And that was how I made that leap from Indiana to New York.
Okay.
And Mademoiselle, which was a thinking girls fashion magazine, and there weren't that many jobs for women in publishing at that time. That's why I mentioned Joan Didion, Grace Schulman. All these people started with that Mademoiselle guest editorship, and then I stayed on for 3 years, and they had said in various publicity that they did, they said, we discovered Carson McCullers, and now we've discovered Sandra. My name was Weiss, and Sandra Weiss. And I started reading about Carson McCullers. Yeah, she's a really good writer, but she used to get drunk and follow her typewriter across the floor. No, I don't think that's a life I'm going to pursue. But basically what happened was as a fiction writer, I was trying to do one perfect word after another rather than just stay with the story. Mm-hmm. And so I was reading all of this amazing fiction. I mean, Mademoiselle got incredible fiction and poetry. We published Czesław Miłosz. I mean, I heard of him when I was still basically a kid. I mean, just finished my undergraduate. And so I started, I was the censor, that big bird was growing on my shoulder. Oh, don't say that, don't say that, don't say that. Right. And so it was really too much attention too early. And I just got a writer's block and came out the other side as a poet. So I was late, other than that embarrassing lifeguard thing. I was late to poetry. I mean, I was in my 30s when I first turned to poetry.
Yeah, so you'd written a lot of fiction up and before that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. David, David Cates?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, and David is, recently in the last, 5, 6, 7 years or whatever it's been now, that he's become fascinated with the idea of poetry, in addition to the fiction work that he's been doing forever. And
Rick Bass is the same way. He always reads poetry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and his influence.
And so I mean, David's writing poetry now, and I thought about it after I started reading these poems, and it's like, well, it doesn't surprise me at all. I remember I used to listen to him read, his fiction out loud. He's a good reader, and it was like, wow, yeah, that's just like it seemed to be the rhythms and just his speech patterns and whatnot were a perfect sort of move to poetry, just a shorter version of where he was at, or more focused, or whatever. Maybe not.
I haven't maybe seen it. I'll have to look for it.
Yeah. It's very. I think you'd enjoy it. So how about another poem?
Robert Sims Reed too.
Bob Reed.
When I was Ralph Beer and I were the editors of Cutbank. And that was enjoyable.
Yeah.
And Bob Reed's work came in just from nowhere. I was like, who is this guy? Mm-hmm. He's a cop in Missoula. Yeah. He writes fiction, but he's a really good poet.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah. I remember years ago after it was right after Ed had passed away, and this, it was a group of grad students that were doing this little journal thing, and they asked me if I wanted to take a turn at editing it or whatever, and I said, yeah, sure, that would be fun. And so I asked around, and because I thought in the process, I got into my mind that, well, I'm just going to kind of dedicate this thing in a way to Ed, because I had all of his leftover stuff, and so I would put some of that stuff in there, and then people he knew along with other people, maybe they might have something. But I asked Rick DeMarinis if he'd like to contribute something, because there were pieces of fiction, there were essay and different kinds of writing that were going to be in it. I didn't even think about the fact that he had also gone through and studied with Dick in the poetry program and all that. So he sent, a handful of these 3 or 4 poems, and it was like, my God, they were wonderful, It was like, he was a hell of a poet.
And Jim Welsh.
Oh, of course. I mean, I experienced, it happened to run into Jim Welch when I was in high school, and heard those poems just before he was able to, before they published him, in Riding the Earth Boy 40. And I just, that was amazing. And you see, that I saw the same thing, of course, in those first 2 little books. They seemed like long prose poems. Which brings me back to when I was reading Except by Nature again, and I did notice that, there was a variety of forms. There was a variety of forms in that book, some of it being prose poems. And because I've had a conversation with 2 or 3 other people about, well, what the hell is a prose poem? I mean, versus flash fiction versus, whatever. And I thought there in that first section, I think, of that particular book, the first prose poem I read, and it had to do with what it was, azaleas. And that definitely had a poem feel to it, like I could read that in lines real easy. But then the next 2 that I read, they were like portraits almost, like dramatic monologues, and they read like fiction. And so, I mean, that seemed to me, I thought, now that seems like what I would guess a prose poem would be. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't know what the hell a prose poem is.
I wish I know we were going here, because I have something I would love to read. But, okay. Azaleas it just got started, and it just became what it became.
Right.
And I would say, but it wasn't trying to be a prose poem. It just became what it was.
Right.
Those other things, and afterwards I got all these solicitations from flash fiction, from prose poetry, from all of these different places. And when I was interviewed about the book, people would always want to know about that. But what you're saying is really astute, because Azaleas is a poem.
Yes.
The others were not. The others, okay. I don't have the part that this is a shortened version of a much longer piece.
Yeah.
But from this, by the way, if anyone has extra time and they want to, I just did a reading at the Bronx Library it was with Alicia Ostreicher and Toy Dericote and so forth. But oh my God, this New York City from the inside. What a gang of writers. I mean, I have never had more fun at a group reading than I did there. Wild folks reading. But because my last name is Alcosser, I have to start out the reading. So, and this will, I'm going to read the poem, and then I'll jump off from that and talk about why the prose.
Okay.
Under the bas-relief of Marx. Okay, I grew up, I lived in New York on Water Street on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and this is talking about the Lower East Side. Under the bas-relief of Marx, under Ingalls, under pavement he lived, the Eggman. I'd bow to him. He'd disappear inside a pickly hole to polish a dozen shells, roll, twine them, as we wet our noses on the diner's brothy beets and bones. An ancient overcoat whistled behind as I turned to watch a naked thumb slide a box of lucifers open, invite me to peer inside. If not for the guard eye of the Bialystoker's zaftig widow warming 3 quivering chins over aluminum foil, I'd feared I'd disappear into the garlic folds of the whistler. But there below was a shtetl, looms and shuttles, foaming pickle barrels, as though etched in copper, cross-hatched streets formed a tiny square where a lead steeple rose to touch the roof of the box. I stared down, almost falling into the whistler's pocket. His skin waddled above me, turkey blue, his coat a stubble, a holy man's room, a place to hide his raw and secret lives, a ghetto of gum chewed down to size, hidden safely in a matchbox, pulled from the linty silence of a pocket. It frightened me. It gave me enormous calm. His perfect kingdom he dropped upon my palm. So, I left the fashion magazine after 3 years because I could see Betsy Talbot Blackwell was the head of it, and I could look at head, and all I could think of, I mean, I have great respect for her, but all I could think of was Miss Havisham and Great Expectations. And I was like, I don't think I want to spend the rest of my life in fashion.
Yeah.
Even though I was in literature, but it was, I wanted to get out in service. And so I started several poetry workshops, and one of them was at the Lower East Side Service Center. And when it got hot, it was unbearable. And so there was a garden right where this poem is set. Not a garden. There was a cyclone fence. And I became, and this is how I met Philip Mcclay, my husband, I became a volunteer for Green Guerrillas, which was an open space screening coalition in New York City that's quite famous. These gardens took off all over the 5 boroughs. And then HUD would come to us and say, well, we're going to tear down this whole block. What do you want to do? And we would go in and interview people to find out what they wanted to do, right, so that they wouldn't turn them into dumps. Well, once they had these gardens, they didn't want to give up these gardens. And Bette Midler came in and saved all of them in New York City, millions of dollars. She bought up all these properties so these gardens could go on. Wow. One of them was that it's no longer there. The very high cyclone fence is still there. Is right across from the Jewish Daily Forward. That's the bas-relief of Marx and Engels, is the Jewish Daily Forward. Isaac Bashevis Singer was still writing there and bringing the work in Yiddish. I adored him. And at night, I don't remember that my mother, my parents, I don't remember anyone reading to me as a child, and yet it's the thing that I love most in the world. And so I would go to sleep listening to him read his stories.
In English?
In English. And I would always be looking for him. I was sure I was going to see him going in and out of the Jewish Daily Forward, but I never did. But what happened was we had no money, so I actually joined Green Guerrillas because they had free seats. I wanted the free seats. And we were using, for trowels, we were using broken beer bottles and broken wine bottles. And I was working with methadone to abstinence patients, clients. And they really got into this. And then at night, when they would go back to the center, I would come in and kind of tidy up the garden, and these Puerto Rican men would come and serenade me because we were growing okra and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it made a huge difference in some of these people's, some of the clients' lives. They went on to learn about nutrition. They were so proud.
Mm-hmm.
But on the 4th of July, all the tomatoes got bombed off of with cherry bombs. They were bombed off of the plants and so forth. And all we had left at the end were zucchini. So they made zucchini soup and zucchini bread and so forth.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
but
There's always lots of zucchini.
Yeah, yeah. But those, I didn't look at them as prose poems. I looked at them as little village tales.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Yeah.
still write those. I like little village tales.
Right, right. Yeah, well, I mean, what are you doing now? I mean, in terms of your writing project or your current writing project? I mean, you must be working on, I mean, most of us are working on something like that, a book, or at least an idea.
I can't give you an idea for, okay, I can tell you things that there are all kinds of ghosts in this book.
Yeah, it's like, do not touch your set.
I thought it was going to be well, first of all, working for 10 years with this scientist changed the way that I felt about poetry. I thought the book was going to be only about animals, and you can see there are a lot of animal
Mm-hmm.
poems, and I've always written
Mm-hmm.
poems about the physical world. And I thought it was going to be all sonnets.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
now they're growing a little bit.
That's why you have sections in the book, right? You
Let
can do
me
whatever you want.
Let me see. I don't know how much time we have, but I could read.
Yeah, we got some time. Yeah,
I could read a couple
more.
of Missoula poems.
Oh, you should. Yes, please.
That they're these longer poems.
Yeah.
Danny Lawless out of Florida, Daniel Lawless edits Plume,
Mm-hmm.
and I recommend it highly. He's such a nice person. He wrote to me, and I was trying to save poems to send out to places where I first published, because I was really lucky. But I never get to that because friends ask me for something. And so he kept writing to me, and I didn't send anything, and I didn't send. But he was so nice that I finally started sending, and then it was like joining this club. I mean, he puts this out once a year, and then he does things online at Plume. And I started looking for this because I wanted to see what all of my friends were publishing. So this is a poem that has a Los Angeles Bitterroot Valley poet in it, Sarah Mcclay. She lives in Los Angeles, but she's a Mcclay from down the
Mcclay Flats.
Yeah, no, from the Bitterroot.
Yeah.
From Tom Mcclay's sister and so forth. So this is set the day we had at Cafe Dolce. I'm so sad. I'd come in on Fridays and I would see a friend, and then I would go.
They're reopening it, you know.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Yeah, as an Italian restaurant. Not as Cafe Dolce, but someone else is going to reopen an Italian restaurant there. So it's a good building for an Italian restaurant.
It's great. And everybody can walk there. And,
Yeah,
you know. Okay, so the poem is called Imago. I know where the morning cloak butterflies come from. I know where they go, I say to my beautiful black Irish friend as we lunch in a cavernous Palladian cafe where moments ago she closed her eyes and rubbed her palms together as I ask about her happiest moments so far this year. She'd driven up the coast from LA in a brand new Seafoam Fiat and she mouths its color, Verde Chiaro, her first new car ever. She'd stopped and rested each evening at the home of an old lover or friend, and she speaks of them now with such tenderness. So begins the weave. I tell her how I came upon them, the cloaks. On a path beside the cabin, 2-inch black and white red harlequin caterpillars that left the willow sapling stripped, and when I craned over the patch, they bristled, vibrated en masse like an imperial dragon, greatly overestimating my stature. My friend looks with vague curiosity. Human conversation always a halting melody for me, but I try to match her happiness with the levity of the butterflies. They're puddling and basking. Didn't Nabokov describe discovering them as the most intense pleasure known to men? Comparing a mourning cloak to his first lover. A dark rustling path where she gripped him by the shoulder, rubbed her sand-dusted shoe against the stocking of her other leg, higher up under the hem. Behind us on the almost summer terrace, sweeping in like aesthetes, just as the lilacs surrender their lush perfume, the western tiger swallowtails jink down through the trees, descend and slip their long tongues and yellow bodies into the lavender bloom. Too much to bear this delicious afternoon. Though we used to be at the age of weddings, my friend and I, then baby showers and soon enough vanishing, while all about the spectacles, the grand sipping and bliss, the wonder of the country and the denuded willow, and the city full of seductive roads like jelly without shape, slowly we approach the next stage, imago. Linnaeus called it when gelatin takes off its mask to become the perfect image of its species. So she was so happy about her lovers and her car and so forth, and all I wanted to talk about was the butterflies. I just amazed, because I'd never seen that little black and white display before.
Yeah.
I mean, they all get together and they make this one dragon. It's quite
interesting.
Quite formidable. And then here's another Montana poem. More than Montana, this is a Missoula poem. It was an oh my God.
Oh, someone's calling you.
It's my plumber. I told Mark, because I didn't see his message until last night, and I said, I have two things going on. I just went to the dermatologist and had my head frozen on one side, and the plumber's calling me at exactly 12:15. So maybe.
So we're probably close to maybe the last poem or two, I suppose, and so then you can call the plumber.
Okay, because you don't mess around with your plumber. They're hard to get.
No, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so this is the my alma mater, the University of Montana campus, which my husband, Philip Mcclay, is now on the Arboretum committee for. It's a state arboretum.
Oh, cool.
And it's really cool. You can go on and find the map and find out every tree that's there. And so I mentioned some of those trees.
Yeah.
So this is called Motherese. When the skinny girl streaks by, I long to be her. Maybe 13, a blue carousel tattooed around her left thigh, just below her cut-off jeans. Not a younger version of me. This one sliding fearlessly downslope on a skateboard. Follow me, she yells at the hidden side of a tree to another girl I cannot see. The shy one who would have been me. And I become the mother of a brave daughter who glides with utter joy, occupying an entire college campus late July. A rhythm to her giant glasses, ponytail, and legs, negotiating each crack in the pavement. We weave in and out of shade, 90 degrees, my mind racing ahead of her life, her risk a form of disobedience, a necessary chemistry, a deviation from the norm, her risk almost holy, nothing gambled but her body. Her voice still sings to me as I enter the pine-paneled library, exact same beat, exaggerated speech melody of motherese, baby talk. Will you be all right? She croons to the girl left behind. None of us can completely escape our female hormones, our DNA. We care for each other this way, in cadence, in layers. Are you sure you'll be okay?
Nice, nice. That moves really fast too because of the line length, I think, and then just what it is, that kind of a descriptive narrative.
And I wanted to say about Hugo, the other things I picked up, he was a student of Redke, and I became a student of the late Redke because of him. And I don't know if you're noticing, but in these two longer poems, they're not sonnets, but they are vowel-rhymed throughout.
Oh yeah, totally. Oh yeah.
So that's a very Northwestern thing.
Yeah, yeah. And somebody else mentioned something. I think, I don't know if it was a poem I had given to somebody, and after they read it, they said, "Oh, that's really interesting. That's something you don't hear a lot of anymore." And I thought, okay, well, that's a reference to probably what the majority of maybe newer poets or poems are going out there. But I think the reference had to do with that kind of music and a lot of that internal rhyme and those vowels and those consonants that keep coming back, and like they're playing a marimba band or something.
Well,
throughout,
it's Welsh. Have you ever look up Welsh poetics? They're the most complex thing on the planet, but it's synhade. It's a form of chiming, and you chime with your vowels.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's quite attractive anyway to the ear. It's like songs, and that's why I think I always liked it, poetry.
Well, I had one more poem, but I'm not going to read it because my plumber. I don't even know this guy.
We need to get to the plumber.
But may I tell them about this?
Oh, sure, yeah.
May I tell you? I already told you.
Yeah.
But I was fortunate to be able to hire at San Diego State and to work with a fabulous human being and poet, Ilya Kaminsky, who edited this 500-page tome, Poetry International. And he was there for 12 years. He is from the Ukraine and was given political asylum at the age of 16, and he's been deaf since he was a young boy. He's a fabulous, fabulous poet. After 12 years, he got an offer he couldn't refuse, and he is at Georgia Tech now. And he left with his wife, who is also a wonderful writer, Katie Ferris. And all of a sudden, I felt like not only was I directing the program, but the dike was sprouting holes all over the place, and I almost didn't have enough fingers to fill the holes. But I took up the editing of Poetry International. Oh my God, it consumes me. But if you would go to poetryinternationalonline.com, you can see what we do online. And then we have a fabulous archive of poets all over the world. We just did a spread on the Ukraine, a Ukrainian book, a Ukrainian poet, and so forth. And then right next to it, Piotr Florshik, who's a former student of mine, who's now just taken a job as the assistant professor of Slavic and global literature at the University of Washington, did a beautiful remembrance of Adam Zagieski, the fabulous Polish poet. So,
are you then editing another print version of that?
We've just done, we've done now, that's why I was saying, this isn't a brand new one, it just happened to be the one that I had back in Montana. These things
Right.
are heavy.
Yeah.
We're doing 27 and 28 just went to the printer, and that's our 25th anniversary
Oh, okay.
issue.
Well, good.
But we're doing as much online as we are the print journal. And for the most part, the print journal, I'm taking things in portfolios from places like Iceland, Argentina, El Salvador, Armenia,
Right.
and you know, things like that. It's very exciting, and when I feel safe traveling again, we did something because of this with this, they have a wonderful poetry festival in Lithuania each year. And so I've got poems in this, and Ilya was on the plane constantly, and he was always off to another country. I'm not quite that.
Well, the pandemic has slowed a little bit of that down, too, I
Yeah,
know.
no kidding.
My son just went to Slovakia for a conference, and you know, and it's a nightmare out there with COVID again and all kinds of stuff going on. So, but anyway, we better let you get to your plumber, and it's just been a pleasure to talk to us. And I forgot to mention to begin with that Sandra Alcosser was the first Poet Laureate of Montana. We should have said that probably to begin with, but thank you, Sandra, for doing this. It's a pleasure. It's great to have you in this group of poets. So
It's fun doing it, isn't it?
it is,
Yeah, you're doing a great job. This
Yeah,
is
well-
just a wonderful idea.
Yeah, it's a good thing to do. All right. Thanks for coming. See you next week.
Bye.
A lifetime filled